in these recent hospitalizations, one of the things that became so clear to me from the perspective of the patient's bed, if you will, is how all my caregivers were suffering. I mean, it just made me cry to see how the nurses and the doctors and the mental health professionals, these were people with really good hearts, you know, but they were so closed down to their own pain. I mean, they were driven ruthlessly by the systems in which they work, unrealistic expectations, inadequate resources, you name it. And so to cope with the moral distress that they were experiencing, they mostly employed strategies that had them ignoring what hurts in themselves. And in the process, they lost touch with their own compassionate hearts, and they met their discomfort with alienation and rejection instead of love. And then what's the natural outcome of that? You pass it on to the people you serve. So I have a real sadness for this predicament that we've gotten ourselves into in healthcare and caring for each other. So today I want to talk to you as just a vulnerable human being, you know, one vulnerable human being to another. And I want to speak to your heart and to your soul directly. And maybe we can understand something about how we've turned this most natural, beautiful, intimate act of caring for one another into a duty, into an obligation, into a series of technological tasks that exhaust everybody and don't heal anyone. So compassion has this direct and integral relationship with suffering. No contact with suffering, no real contact with suffering, not much compassion. A few years ago, I suffered a series of heart attacks. And I had a triple bypass, big deal, big surgery. And after, when I was recovering at home, a very famous Tibetan teacher, I won't say who, he called me up, and I knew that he had trouble with his own heart. And so, you know, he called me up to sort of cheer me up, so to speak. But I thought, he's going to know something about this. So I asked him, you know, how did you deal with it all? How did you deal with the drama and the confusion and the precariousness and the beauty, actually, that emerges with that kind of traumatic illness? How'd you do it? And then there was this sweet sort of Tibetan giggle. And he said, well, I thought it's good to have a heart. And if we have a heart, we should expect we'll have problems. And then he giggled some more, and he reminded me to rest, and then he hung up. That was it. That was the whole exchange. You know, he didn't give me any esoteric Buddhist practice or any, you know, other counsel besides that. But afterwards, I thought to myself, he's right, you know. It's true. All hearts will have problems. All beings will suffer. And it's our work, in a way, to accept that truth as caregivers, as human beings. If we're always trying to banish suffering, we can't learn anything from it. And we won't be of any real assistance to anybody else. So at least in my experience, compassion is a kind of attunement, we could say, to exactly where the other person is, to what matters most to them in this moment, to the exact face of their suffering. And this compassion has no agendas, no judgments, no shoulds. You know, we can't help a person if we're trying to change them. Maybe I should say that again. We can't help a person if we are trying to change them. So when my caregiver's attention was only fixed on problem solving or on the monitor that they brought in the room, it felt like they were addressing what should be happening, me getting better, and what should be important, which is reducing my symptoms, and how I should be in this moment. But compassion expresses something different. It expresses the gentleness, the kindness that's necessary for our heart, our soul to relax, to trust. Without compassion, we can't open to suffering. It's just too much. So when compassion is present as this kind of attunement, it becomes clear to our hearts. We feel ourselves coming closer in a way to some kind of what I want to call soul-to-soul meeting. So here's an example. At the hospice, at the Zen hospice, which I guided for 20 years, there was a man dying of AIDS. His name was Stephen, and he was an extraordinary man. I mean, when you went into his room, you felt like you were going into some kind of sanctuary. He was a beautiful man. He'd really done his homework. And then down the hall, there was another guy, Rick, wonderful guy too, but in addition to his HIV status, he'd had a stroke and he was paralyzed from one side and he had aphasia, so he couldn't speak well. And he was angry all the time. And all of our efforts to try and help him sort of bounced off this defensive shield that he had around him. Yeah. So there's one morning I went to him and I said, "Hey, Rick, it looks like Stephen might be dying today. And if you want to say goodbye to him, now's the time." I did this with everybody. And so Rick sort of nodded his head and I said, "Okay." And so we got up and he put his arm around my shoulder and we limped down the hallway to Stephen's room. And I came in and sat Rick down on Stephen's bed. And I went and sat in the corner because that's my way. Don't interfere unless you really need it. And then I watched these two men. It was so extraordinary. I watched these two men enter into this kind of silent exchange, a profound exchange, but not a word spoken between them, really. It went on for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, not a word. And then I noticed a really simple thing. Rick just nodded his head like that. And Stephen said, "Yeah, wasn't that great?" And it was extraordinary, actually. Rick got up and left the room and Stephen died that night. So what happened between these two men? I don't know exactly, but what I witnessed was something like this, Rick was there with Stephen, who was actively dying. And he knew that he was going to be dying shortly, in a matter of weeks, perhaps. And he was scared. He was really frightened. And he looked at his own destiny, if you will, in looking at Stephen. But Stephen, he looked back to him with so much mercy, so much kindness, so much compassion, actually. And he could do that because he'd done his homework. He'd really looked, he'd really explored his own relationship to fear, to grief, to loss, to his own dying process. And so there was this remarkable exchange between them. Rick's fear, Stephen's compassion, helping to transform that fear. I don't think we heal because our problems are solved. I think we heal by reconnecting with what we feel we might have lost contact with in the fear and contraction of illness. That's how it's been for me anyway. And again, it's felt as this contact, I want to say. It's felt as some kind of self-acceptance, of course, but also a quality of openness to my condition. And this breeds a certain kind of courage, which allows us, I'd say, to go toward what we and others most want to avoid, our suffering. Because that's where the healing's always found. It's in the middle of the suffering. So compassion has this capacity. Well, I want to just refer to it as a kind of guidance. a guidance from our nature, that, and true guidance, real guidance, right, has to care absolutely for you. And again, it has to not just care broadly or generally for you, it has to care particularly for you. And so compassion has about it this empathetic precision, actually. Like there was a woman at the hospice and she was dying and she wanted to get married. So she asked me if I would perform the wedding, if I'd be the facilitator for the wedding. And I said, sure, I'd love to. I said, but what you really need is a wedding coordinator. And I'm really good at that. So she said, okay. And every day I would come and visit her. And every day we'd talk about the wedding. And I'd ask her about the cake and whether she was going to be in her bed. She couldn't stand anymore, or in a wheelchair. And what about this guy she was marrying? And, what'd she think about him? And, when somebody wants to get married a few weeks before their death, it's not just about a stereotypical wedding. So these conversations about the details of the wedding were just our way to connect and for me to really listen in to her as best I could. And one day in the middle of talking about cake and what dress she would wear, she just broke into tears and she said, I just want my mom to be there. And her mom had died some years before. And so, but it still was there. It was her wish, her deep wish. And so I could say, oh, I'm just sorry, it's too bad. Is there somebody else you want to invite? But instead I said, well, how could we have your mom there? And she said, well, my mom was a poet and she wrote these beautiful things and I have her poems. And would you read some at the wedding? And I said, sure, I'd be happy to. You see, in that moment, her suffering was not about her terminal lung cancer or even the fact that she was dying. It was that she was getting married and she wanted her mom to be there and her mom couldn't be there. So compassion had to address the specificity of that particular suffering. So when our attention, our non-judgmental attention, is really attuned exactly to where the heart is, then the heart responds and it feels seen, cared for, and it opens. And so our attention has to be cognizant of the whole spectrum of considerations that are there, the cancer in this case, the fact that she's dying, etc., but also attuned to what matters most in this moment. What usually passes as compassion is good counsel or kind words, and that's great, But compassion isn't just an emotional state. It's this fierce quality of our being that allows us to stay present and tender and relational. The common experience, or the common understanding, I should say, of compassion is that we should help people to feel safe, that we should let them know that there's no danger. That's a compassionate thing to do. And it's great if you can do it, that's wonderful. But the people I work with, they didn't feel safe, and no matter what I did, I couldn't instill that in them in any way. So the job wasn't to try and create some conditions in which there was no danger. It was to evoke in them, actually, their capacity to be with danger, to go toward the suffering. Okay. And when I speak about this, when I speak about compassion this way, I sort of feel like I should put a warning label on the bottle, because when you open, when you start to abide in compassion in a real way, a lot of suffering is going to show up in your life. And I think that's because that pain wants to expose itself to the healing agent of loving kindness, of compassion. Some years ago, I helped to facilitate a retreat for 150 people at Auschwitz and Birkenau. We sat on the tracks at Birkenau for 10 days, really plunging ourselves into this deep suffering, right? The worst of humanity, we could say. And every day I would facilitate a group of maybe 20 or 30 people, and the other teachers who were there were doing the same. In my group, there happened to be a woman who was now older, who'd been a child in the camps. She survived, but she'd been a child in the camps. And in Birkenau, there was one horse barn, one dormitory that was just for children. Yeah, they were separated from their parents. And she was in that particular horse barn. So one night I had access to the camps at night, so I went back in to sit meditation in the middle of the night in one of these horse barns where people had lived and died. And they're long buildings with just shelves that people slept on. And I sat in the darkness there, just doing my practice, doing my best to evoke compassion. And into the darkness, on the other end of this barn, came this woman who had been a child in that same barn. And on the other end of the barn, I was sitting there, and I began to hear these wails, these sounds that I've never heard before in my life. They were animal-like, actually. And they were torturous sounds, actually. And so I got up and I walked to the other end of the barn and I sat next to her. I didn't say anything because you can't touch that kind of pain with words. You can just stay present for it. You can bear witness to it. And we sat for hours, actually, and she wailed. At times I would hold her, but mostly I just sat next to her. Hardly a word was spoken between us. And the dawn came and we got up and we walked back to the kind of hostel that we were all staying in. And I had to leave for Germany that day. I went to Germany to teach. And I had arranged to do a series of retreats in Germany on grief and forgiveness. And I was teaching this one program, I can't remember, I think it was Berlin. And 200 or 300 people in the room. And I've been talking about this subject of grief and forgiveness for days. And it was the end. It was time to go home. And there was one last person raising their hand, and I thought, oh, it's time to go. But I just felt, oh, I should respond. And this woman stood up and she said, look, she said, I've been listening to you talk about grief and forgiveness. She said, I can't feel anything. She said, my father was a prisoner in the camps and he died there. And I can't forgive, and I can't really even feel the loss. My heart's like ice, it's like stone. Now, I hadn't mentioned anything about going to Auschwitz or being in Birkenau. I hadn't said a word because, it still can be difficult in Germany to speak about this. But it was there in the field somehow. And all I could do was really, again, stand in silence with this woman, listening generously, listening devoutly, actually, to her.